Hi, okay, I'm going to do a video on the strengths and weaknesses of the presidential primary and caucus system. Those for congressional primaries are slightly different, so I'll do those another time. So, the strengths of the system first of all. Well, firstly, they actually enable the electorate to influence the choice of potential candidates for the presidency. So if you look at 2008, for example, 30% of the electorate participated in the primary and caucus system, and in fact in the New Hampshire primary in January 2008, 53.6% of the population voted. So significant numbers of people are able to vote in the primary caucuses. The second major strength is that it does lead to a wide range of candidates pushing themselves forward, and therefore allows a large range of issues to be debated within the parties. So, a good example of that is 2012. In the 2012 primary and caucuses, I would say the whole spectrum of the Republican Party was represented by one or more candidates. So if you look what happened, for example, Ron Paul, who's the more libertarian end of the Republican Party, his views were represented by himself. You also had the social conservatives by people like Michelle Bartman, Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum, and you had more moderates, for example Mitt Romney, more of a fiscal conservative, who participated. So it does allow a wide range of candidates to put themselves forward, and therefore allows a large number of issues to be debated within the parties. A third strength of the primary and caucuses is that outsiders are given a chance to shine, if you like, and this is often at the expense, if you like, of the party bosses and perhaps the party-approved candidates. So again, you look back at 1992, Bill Clinton at the time was governor of Arkansas, not a particularly kind of well-known figure nationally, but the primary season which he then won allowed this outsider the chance to be nominated as the candidate, and as we know became the president. In a similar situation, you could say Barack Obama in 2008. He was a bit of a rising star in the Democrat Party, which had only been elected into the Senate for Illinois a few years previously, and he defeated Hillary Clinton, who most people thought would win that election, and also, if you like, she was more of the party person at the time, being the wife of the former president. So outsiders are often given a chance at the expense of, if you like, more insider candidates. A fourth strength, you might argue, is that it is a demanding process which takes place from January all the way through to June or July, and it is argued that this is needed for such a demanding job as the eventual president. So arguably, Obama was a better candidate and was better prepared for the general election fight against John McCain in 2008 because of his campaign against Hillary Clinton. He had to show himself as being able to raise money, he had to show himself as an able debater, his policies were scrutinised, and also it showed his organisational skills. You might want to say that Mitt Romney, for example, when he beat Obama in the first debate of the general election, perhaps his sharper debating may have been due to the many debates he'd held in the primaries in the previous 10 months or so, whereas Barack Obama didn't have that many debates in the primary season for the Democrat side because he was essentially the only candidate. So it is a very demanding process which is needed for such a demanding job. There are, though, serious weaknesses to this system. The first one is the actual turnout and voter apathy. This is especially the case once a candidate has actually reached his majority, because those primaries that take place after he's reached a majority of delegates are kind of irrelevant. So again, if you look at 2012, in the Iowa caucus that year, well in this year, sorry, only 19.9% of people voted, so it's quite a low percentage of voters. If you look back at 2008, which is seen as a high point, if you like, of people participating in primaries and caucuses, it wasn't universal. So North Dakota, for example, the turnout there was only 5.9% in the 2008 caucus in North Dakota. Added on to this, of course, that in some states you have closed primaries, which therefore deliberately exclude independent registered voters. So again, the turnout can actually be affected or be quite low in the primaries. Connected to this is the second weakness, and that is that the people that tend to vote in primaries and caucuses, especially caucuses, tend not to be very representative of the entire population. If you look at 2008 at the Republican Party, in the Iowa caucus there was a survey done, it's in the Ashby book. Of the Republicans who voted in that caucus, 60% identified themselves as born-again Christians, 45% of them identified themselves as being very conservative, and 69% of them lived in rural areas. Again, this is not really representative of the entire American population, and may explain the success of social conservatives like Rick Santorum in the 2012 Republican caucus of Iowa. On a similar thing, if you look at New Hampshire, the Republican primary that took place in 2008, on a similar survey, 36% of them who participated had incomes over $100,000. So again, the voters in these primaries and caucuses, especially the closed primaries, tend not to be very representative, which often leads to, in the case of the Republican Party, more social conservatives getting elected, or in terms of the Democrats, more liberal candidates tend to get favoured. A third major weakness, it's more of a process weakness really, is the front loading, and this has led to some states becoming particularly important. So, as we mentioned just before, Iowa and New Hampshire both are the first two states, and they are not particularly representative of the rest of the United States. But they seem to be particularly important because they're the first primary and caucuses, and therefore important for a candidate to gain momentum. In the Republican Party, South Carolina, which is also a January primary, has become quite important in some recent cycles. So, for example, George W. Bush beat John McCain there in year 2000, and as we know went on to win the nomination. And in 2008, John McCain managed to defeat his rivals in South Carolina and get the nomination. So South Carolina is one to look out for being important in the Republican Party. There has been some attempts to get round this front loading by having things like Super Tuesday to try and mitigate this importance, and some states in 2008 moved their primaries earlier. For example, California did, and Florida and Michigan did. But generally what tends to happen is that states which come after the majority of delegates have been selected for one candidate tend to lose all their importance. So if you look at June 2012 in the Republican primaries, California, which is perhaps the largest state in terms of population, saw very little activity because Mitt Romney had already won his majority of delegates. A fourth weakness of the primaries is that it's long and expensive. The primaries start in January and end in about June or July time. Then you've got the national conventions, then you've got the actual general election takes place from November, October through to November. So it leads to an entire virtual 12 months of campaigning, and of course because it's such a long process you get voter fatigue, but also it's expensive, and those candidates who can raise lots of money tend to do better. So in 2008 both Clinton and Obama between them raised and spent $500 million during this process. And if you look at 2012, the election in total cost over $1 billion between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, and that's with the Democrats not even having a competitive primary. And if you look at something like Iowa, $12 million was spent on the adverts in Iowa before their primary in January. Another major weakness of the primaries is that it can actually lead to damaged candidates. Mitt Romney, for example, he was attacked in the primaries on TV by his rivals, especially Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum, and he was criticised over his social conservative views and was he actually cut muster, if you like, with the social conservatives, and also his business past was attacked as well. Barack Obama, the sitting president, basically could just sit back and watch the Republicans devour each other. And it was interesting, he actually used some very similar adverts, especially attacking Mitt Romney's business past in the election. So obviously he looked at these adverts and saw which ones were effective. In 2008, Hillary Clinton put out attack ads against Obama, highlighting his inexperience. The famous thing was 3 AM morning call, and who would you like to be in the White House. It's interesting because John McCain in the actual general election proper used some similar ads to attack Obama in the election campaign. So it can actually weaken a candidate against his opponents. And occasionally it can lead to some bitterness. So for example in year 2000, John McCain and George W. Bush fought a very bitter campaign in the primaries, and John McCain was not a particular fan of George W. Bush and kind of let it be known that he wasn't. And then of course there are other weaknesses as well which you might want to have a look at. Things like, for example, there's a lack of peer review. The control of the parties is threatened. So if you're doing a question on political parties and their weaknesses, a weakness of political parties is that they don't have much control over the nomination of candidates, and also this entire process is dominated by the media, you know, and who's up and who's down, and the media are a little bit obsessed by opinion polls and looking at who's getting momentum and who isn't. So if you look back, for example, in 1992, Bill Clinton claimed to be the comeback kid, and John McCain did something similar in 2008, despite Bill Clinton not actually winning the New Hampshire primary, and the fact that John McCain did win that primary after a fairly poor performance in Iowa. So the media are obsessed by these things and who's up and who's got momentum, etc, etc. For extra reading on this, the Edward Ashby book, which is in the library, the latest edition is quite good, especially on page 5 to 9, along with things like, books like Anthony Bennett, of course, and William Story, and the Little Revision Guide as well. So they are just some of the strengths and weaknesses of the primary and caucus season, and things you might want to include if it comes up in the exam.